Welcome, everybody.
Watch this for me. I'm going to have to.
So glad that you could join us. This is our regular weekly program sponsored by Universal Peace Federation. And this program especially is sponsored by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development. And we're looking at prospects for peace on the Korean Peninsula. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's program, Dr. Michael Jenkins, who is the chairman of the Universal Peace Federation in North America and president and of the co-sponsor of this webinar, the Washington Times Foundation. Dr. Jenkins, take it away.
Thank you, Roger, and welcome to our audience throughout America and throughout the world. Today's topic is economics, business, and trade relations, prospects for peace on the Korean Peninsula. The situation in North Korea is one of increasing isolation and economic stagnation. The North Korean regime has become even more insular under the threat of the COVID pandemic, shutting down its borders to all but essential traffic. Economic sanctions, especially those restricting the import of oil, are causing disruption to food production and could lead to widespread famine. In this atmosphere, what can we expect from the business and economic community to be able to ease the tensions and create a climate of understanding that would be conducive to the opening of North Korea? We have three very prominent expert guests, Mr. Thomas P. Mcdivot, Congressman Bob McEwen, and Reverend Dr. Art Lindsley. At this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Thomas P. Mcdivot. He's chairman of the Washington Times. He is also on the board of the directors of the media program for the Washington Times, on the Washington Times Global, the Washington Times Global Media Group. He's the chairman of that organization. He was vice president of marketing years ago with of marketing and communications for the Points of Light Foundation, and which was launched, of course, by former President George H.W. Bush. In 2019, he was appointed chairman of H.J. Magnolia U.S. Holdings, a corporate group including the New Yorker Hotel, Manhattan Center in New York, and also Ocean Peace Fishing Company and the Washington Times. Mr. Mcdivot also serves as the global coordinator of the International Association for Economic Development that we are sharing with today. Both these global projects are projects of the UPF International. I'd like you to welcome with me at this time, Chairman Thomas P. Mcdivot. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins, my good friend. Thank you for your leadership, along with Roger Weatherall, our U.S. coordinator of IED, and Alan Jessen, who's on the call today, the North American coordinator. The International Association of Peace and Economic Development was launched about a year and several months ago, February 2020 in Seoul, Korea, at our World Summit, where we had over 6,000 top leaders from various sectors. And the IAED program had about 500 people. We had the famous Singapore investor, Jim Rogers, and people like Neil Bush, who's a good friend of ours, and Professor Bill Imeke from Columbia, a renowned expert on social value investing. And the big idea that we are going after here is that business and economy has a higher purpose than just gaining wealth for the corporation or for the person. And that, as you can see in so many instances around our country, businesses can make an impact in such a powerful way. Same thing is true globally. And when we look at the Korean Peninsula as a linchpin of geopolitical harmony down the road, if we paint the picture of what North Korea would look like if it was a free market, if the people were able to sell goods and do the kind of commerce that others do around the world, life would change. And that's one of the things that I think IED can do, is paint that picture of what the Korean Peninsula would be like. IED has a strong sense of direction. We want business people that want to be part of a community, that also want to grow professional development and their own personal transformation from a faith-based perspective that's very inclusive. And also as a network of business professionals and economic people and business school teachers and entrepreneurs and those of you who are online today, especially those who want to start your own company. We'd like to be a feeder system, a support system for that. So your own growth, the growth of a network that can really reinforce each other with higher purpose, a sense of higher purpose. And then finally, we can make an impact. And what's really powerful about UPF is the multidisciplinary approach. We've got an association in media, in the religious sector, elected officials. Dr. Jenkins heads up a network of almost 7,000 incumbent parliamentarians. And then you have people in the academic realm and the arts and culture. And all of this is working together. It kind of comes out of the whole notion that Bill Bright founded years ago called the 7 Mountain Theory of how to influence culture. It's kind of updated in a way and global. So with that, we've got 2 fabulous people, and Dr. Jenkins will do the formal introduction, but I'm just so proud and happy to be on this program with 2 very close friends of the Washington Times. And Dr. Jenkins and I have had so many lunches and dinners and travels with Bob McEwen, former congressman, and Dr. Art Lindsley. Art and I and our Times people put together 2 special sections on faith and flourishing and faith at work. And the reason is because Art Lindsley is an absolute expert, a scholar on applying biblical principles to the workplace. Dr. Bob McEwen, former member of Congress, also a champion, an astute speaker on worldview, how to apply biblical principles to the governance and leadership. These men are mentors of ours, and I call them my brothers. They're my older brothers, and just so happy to have them. And so Dr. Jenkins, thanks for the moment to say hi. And I just am so grateful for all of you who are tuning in. Please get involved with IED. Get a hold of Roger and Alan after this and be involved, because we can really make a difference together. Thanks all. God bless and be healthy. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you for all you're doing to lead the Washington Times. It's such a great newspaper and has so much impact, especially at this time when our values are under attack. And once again, we thank you as chairman of the Washington Times. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Art Lindsey, Vice President of Theological Initiatives for Faith, Work, and Economics. Dr. Lindsley oversees the development of a theology that integrates faith, work, and economics. Since 1987, he served as the president and senior fellow at the C.S. Lewis Institute. Prior to that, he was director of educational ministries at the Ligonier Valley Study Center and staff specialist with the Coalition for Christian Outreach in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's also co-founder of the Reformed Theological Seminary's Washington, D.C. campus and serves on the executive committee for the Geneva Institute for Leadership and Public Policy. He's a renowned author. He wrote Set Free, Restoring Religious Liberty for All, Be Transformed, and Love, the Ultimate Apologetic. At this time, please welcome with me Reverend Dr. Art Lindsley. Welcome, Art.
It's great to be on with you. I noticed that I'm really glad to have Tom McDivot there. I've really enjoyed my time with him. We've worked together a lot, met many times, and have loved putting together the things for the Washington Times. Also spent many times with Bob McEwen, and I'm really appreciative of him and the contribution he makes through many different arenas, including the Council for National Policy. So it's great to be here and a real honor to be able to speak to you. Well, I've got a challenge to be able to have, say, 20 minutes to be able to speak to you on about 7 different points. And I'm going to try to give you something of substance, as well as some of my background and experience, and hopefully you can be able to ask questions coming out of it. I heard that's always good before you talk to say what you're going to say, then say it, then say what you said. And so I'm going to give you sort of my outline, and I'll try to cover it as quickly as I can. Okay, our topic is economics and business relationships and prospects for peace on the Korean Peninsula. I'm going to start with the last part of the topic first, dealing with peace, then move a little bit more towards the business aspect afterwards. But I'm going to try to cover 7 points, the number of perfection, And here they are. Number one, that we desire to work for peace and reconciliation. Number two, we need to be fighters for peace. Number three, we need to find areas of possible cooperation. Number four, we shouldn't give up political, economic, and religious freedom. Number five, economic freedom has been a key to South Korea's success. Number six, to pursue the right kind of freedom. Number seven, to remember the Mica Mandate, and I'll define that when I get to it. First of all, we desire to work for peace and reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. We all desire to create the reality of a more peaceful world in Korea. And we need to keep in mind that this is an uphill battle. Peace can never be taken for granted. Of 3,421 years in past history, only 261 have had no war. So we can't be naive about the difficulties we face. War is one of the constants of history. Jesus said in the Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers. Notice not just peace, but peacemakers. Shalom is an Old Testament Hebrew word that means peace, but peace there means not just an absence of conflict, but a kind of wholeness. It means a kind of flourishing in every direction. That's the kind of peace we want, not just an absence of conflict, but a kind of flourishing in every direction. We need to be fighters for peace. It's the second major point. I did a recent interview with David Beasley, who's the executive director of the UN World Food Program, who just won for that organization the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize. He said in that interview that food, providing food as he does, is a weapon for peace because there's a relationship between hunger and conflict. For instance, those who don't have food sometimes desire to take it from those who have it. Similarly, we need to forge strategies that can promote peace and lessen conflict. We need to find areas of possible cooperation. I represent the Geneva Institute for Leadership and Public Policy. I'm on their executive committee. And a little bit of our history that's involved with Korea is in September 2019, the Geneva Institute signed an MOU at the demilitarized zone with Governor Moon Sun Choi of Gangwon Province to work together for peace and reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula. We've been pursuing that ever since. In November 2019, we hosted a Korean delegation in Washington, D.C. and facilitated meetings at the White House, at the State Department, and later at the Senate. And February 2020, and then later this year in February 2021, I participated in the Pyeongchang Peace Forum. In 2020, that Peace Forum had 4,000 people from 43 countries. So it was a pretty extensive event. I participated on a panel at that point. In 2021, it didn't have any foreign visitors, but it had people from 43 countries, from 231 speakers and 140,000 connections on the internet. And you can find the whole sessions on YouTube. The conference was acknowledged by President Moon in a letter at the beginning of the conference, and also the Prime Minister came to speak live. And so it's a major factor and force to really work towards peace and reconciliation. And Governor Moon Sun Choi is right at the very center of helping to make that happen. Now, there's some areas of cooperation that we can work on, and some of it is kind of low-hanging fruit. That's some stuff that's already been done and can be done more in the future. For instance, sports. The 2018 Winter Olympics was held in Pyeongchang, and that was a tremendous symbol in having North Korea, South Korea participants on those teams. And we have in 2024 the Youth Olympics that are coming up again at Pyeongchang. Great desire to incorporate North Korean and South Korean people in that Youth Olympics. I'm going to be working together with the leadership of the committee that will help make that happen. There's also a major area that perhaps some of you may be aware of, but most people are not. And that's the repatriation of soldiers killed in the Korean War. There are about 1,000 soldiers that are still felt to be there at the DMZ. And coming out of the Singapore summit with President Trump and Kim Jong-un in 2018, there was a real initiative to move forward in that arena again. And there are about 55 boxes or coffins with bones of soldiers found in the DMZ that have been brought forward. And DNA analysis has really brought a number of these back to the families. And that's been a tremendous source of outreach. I remember the governor, Moon Choi, we just had a recent Zoom call with him, and he showed a whole bunch of slides or pictures of what happened there. And there was a particularly powerful picture, not only of the various coffins that were there, but also of North Korean and South Korean soldiers, and also US soldiers standing together in really being able to accomplish that mission. And that's a tremendous thing to continue to pursue. Also, food, as I mentioned from David Beasley, is a weapon of peace. And UN World Food Program has an office in Seoul where people can make contributions to give, say, to North Korea. They've also held an office for many years in Pyeongchang, the capital of North Korea, where they've been able to distribute food. So that's one area where we can reach out and help to provide humanitarian assistance as far as it's possible, given the sanctions, to North Korea. So there's also an area that requires work that Governor Moon Choi wants to restore tourism to between South Korea and North Korea. We went the last time we were there in 2020. We went up to the DMZ on the east coast of South Korea, and then we also went down to a station, and I don't know if I can pronounce it fully correctly, Jinjin's statement in Gosong, and there was a train that went from that big, massive station, a very impressive station, and it was a train track that went up into North Korea, and there's a mountain there, Gumgang Mountain, or another way that they say it in English, Diamond Mountain. That's supposed to be one of the most beautiful mountains in Korea. And so people used to go up on that train and stay in a hotel there and be able to at least have some contact. That unfortunately ended, and I won't go into the details of it, in 2008, but the governor would like to see that restored so that it could bring some contact between the two. So that's a question that can be addressed in the future. Number 4, these are some areas that I say that there were possible cooperation. Number 4, we need to not give up on political, economic, and religious freedom going forward. I believe that a nation will not flourish without political, economic, and religious freedom. And a nation will not even be stable without political, economic, and religious freedom. There's a three-legged stool that Michael Novak often talked about in his classic book, Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. And it's like the 3 legs are political freedom, economic freedom, and then the other one is religious, moral, cultural freedom that's necessary to undergird political freedom and economic freedom along the way. And it's crucial that all 3 be together for a nation to flourish. I could speak much more about this, but in my 20-minute time frame, I can't really. But it's been one of the key principles of my life going forward, is to really be able to forward all 3 of these and write about all 3. Well, particularly economic freedom has been a key to South Korea's success. As David Beasley put it in his interview, in 2 generations, South Korea has gone from being a recipient nation of the World Food Program to a donor nation. In fact, it's almost in the top 10 of nations that actually give to the UN World Food Program, which is very impressive. And it's really because they pursued this path in one way or another towards political, economic, and religious freedom. The picture that's on the introduction to this seminar is, of course, the classic satellite picture of North Korea and South Korea at night. And that picture shows, of course, many lights in South Korea and maybe only a point of light at Pyeongchang in North Korea. And that's because of the policies that they pursued. In fact, in many ways, South Korea is a model for the rest of the world in how to move out of desperate poverty by pursuing certain principles into flourishing that they have right now. And a lot of the reason for that is that they work together with government, nonprofits, and particularly markets in being able to move forward. Like in terms of economic freedom, it's interesting to look at the past and say that in 1800, 85% of people lived in desperate poverty. And desperate poverty has been defined as $1.25 a day, or now has been upgraded to $1.90 a day. In 1950, 50% of people were in desperate poverty. In 1992, 25%. In 2007, 15%. In 2015, 9.6%. And this came not from foreign aid, but from markets. Jim Kim said if we pursue this kind of economic production of markets, that desperate poverty will be eliminated by 2030. To sum it up, in 25 years, 25 countries have risen out of desperate poverty. All right, number 6, we need to pursue the right kind of freedom. There is a difference between what Os Guinness has called the 1776 view of freedom and the 1789 view of freedom. The 1776 view of freedom is the freedom that was around the founders of the American Revolution. And the 1789 view is the idea of freedom that came out of the French Revolution. The 1776 view of freedom involves what Oz called the Golden Triangle, that freedom requires virtue, virtue requires faith, and faith requires freedom. Again, let me say that again. Freedom requires virtue, virtue requires faith, and faith requires freedom. This kind of faith-based freedom was the foundation of America. It's a kind of values that are based upon this faith-based moral values. The idea that freedom means that you're not just free to do whatever you want to do. It's within the constraints of character, within the constraints of virtue, that you are to exercise your freedom. It's more freedom to rather than the second view, the 1789, of freedom from any restriction. Okay, the 1789 view of freedom was the freedom of the French Revolution. And that's a freedom without any constraints. They wanted to destroy religion. In fact, one of the phrases is that they wanted to strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest. So there was a desire to really end authority and to end religion in the whole process of doing things. So that freedom went one way and faith and virtue went the opposite direction. And this is true, even Tocqueville mentioned this in some of his writings, that whole difference between the freedom that was at the foundation in America and the freedom that was defined in the French Revolution. And by the way, we have this kind of freedom, the battle over it right now within America. Do we want to have this faith-based moral values at the root of freedom? Or do we want to have freedom without restriction of any kind of definition of what it really means? And that's where the battle right now is, in the middle of the culture. It's a really serious thing. So we must have faith-based freedom to undergird political, economic, and religious freedom. And fourth, we need to remember the Mica Mandate. That's a name I've made up for Micah 4:4. Micah 4:4 was actually George Washington's favorite verse. He used it about 50 different times. There's a book by Daniel Dreisbach that really talks about the faith of the founders. And he mentions about 50 different times within his writings. It's really what he wanted for America. And it's very profound, actually. And it goes like this: each one will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, with no one to make them afraid. In other words, sit, meaning to be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor, to be able to sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree and be able to enjoy the work that they'd done. Under their own vine and under their own fig tree. The private property was right at the foundation of what he believed and what I believe is essential for a nation to flourish. And private property rights is an essential thing. You go back to a book, A Mystery of Capital by Hernando de Soto. It provides an axiomatic argument for this kind of thing around the world, with no one to make them afraid. That was the third part. The rule of law has got to be at the foundation of any society that's going to be able to flourish. And so there are many more things I can say here, but let me just go back over and say what I said here. There's number one, there's a desire to work for peace and reconciliation. I think that we all share. Number two, we need to be fighters for peace and realize it's not going to be an easy thing. It's going to be an uphill battle. Third, we need to find areas of cooperation, such as the ones I've mentioned and already others. Don't give up on the idea of political, economic, and religious freedom. It's the only basis on which a nation can flourish. Fifth, remember economic freedom has been a key to South Korea's success. South Korea, by the way, was about 26th in the list of economic freedom on the Economic Freedom of the World report. And North Korea was last at 178 out of 178, which spells a lot about the difference between the lights in South Korea and the lack of lights in North Korea. Remember the Mica Mandate, that each one shall sit under their own vine and fig tree with no one to make them afraid. So I think I've finished within the time frame. I would love to discuss all these more fully, but thank you for this opportunity to be able to share with you.
Art, that was a wonderful presentation. We learned so much and we want to discuss much more. These are the fundamental principles that allow for prosperity and development, both religious, political, and economic freedom, which you speak so clearly about. And we'll be coming back to you with some questions for our discussion. At this time, we have the honor of presenting to you Congressman Bob McEwen. Congressman McEwen served 6 prestigious terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Ohio. During his congressional tenure, Bob was selected by his colleagues to the senior position as one of 4 Republicans on the powerful House Rules Committee that manages the floor time for members and has jurisdiction over all legislation. He was a member of the House Select Committee on Intelligence and a U.S. delegate to the European Parliament for over a decade. In 2020, he was appointed by President Donald Trump to the 1776 Commission to better enable a rising generation to understand the history and principles of the founding of the United States. He was appointed to the Defense Science Board Permanent Task Force on Threat Reduction for the Department of Defense. He currently is the executive director of the most powerful Council for National Policy. We really want to thank Bob for being with us today. His wife, Liz, also participates by his side in this work for freedom, peace, and faith in God. Let's welcome the Honorable Bob McEwen, U.S. Congressman, 1981 to 93, and now Chairman of the Council on National Policy. Bob, welcome.
Well, Michael, thank you so very much. It's an honor to be with you and be with Tom, and then to hear the presentation by Art, who is such an expert and written so many books and articles on this area that I'm just, I feel like the mule that got entered in the Kentucky Derby, and the owner knew he wasn't going to win, but he was going to be in some mighty fine company. And so I'm honored to be in some fine company here. And just to make a couple of observations, you know, I majored in economics because I enjoy economics. But if you read most of the books or ask people about economics, they tend to go into charts and formulas and things and miss the point. And so what I'd like to do is just make a couple of observations as to how wealth is created. And it's so appropriate that the topic would be peace and economic development, because what is war? War is when you destroy wealth. That's what war does. War goes around and it blows up dams and bridges and houses and things. War destroys wealth. So if there's going to be economic development, there has to be peace. For without peace, there can be no economic development. Economic development is a fancy term for wealth creation. That is, that they develop the things that God put on this earth. They take iron ore and make it into steel, which then make it into an automobile. And that is very appropriate, that we would then think about the beautiful Korean Peninsula. You know, the leader of North Korea made an observation about 3.5 years ago and said he would like to meet the president of the United States. Now, if you're in the diplomatic business, you say things, but you don't do things. If you're in business, you do things, you don't say things. And so we had a businessman who was in the White House. And when the head of North Korea said, I'd like to meet the president of the United States, his response was, that's fine, when? And so they decided about 2 weeks later that they would get together. And when they went to meet for the very first time, and of course, all of the professional diplomats, they were just so distraught. I remember watching the commentary as the two of them were meeting in Singapore, and they were saying, now this is so inappropriate for these people to talk like this. They said there should have been at least 2.5 years of preparation. now I like to put off studying till the last week of the semester, but 2.5 years is really, I don't know quite how you could string anything out that long. But when they got together, the president of the United States was a developer, and he knew the condition of North Korea. And I say that because as an economist, they like to explain that the reason some nations are successful is because they have temperate climate, or they have natural resources, or they have a work ethic or whatever. And so you and I know that North and South Korea is the same heritage, the same culture, the same language, the same climate. And so why is it that one is poor and the other is rich? And a businessman from New York, President Trump, understood that. And so he had the diplomatic corps, the Central Intelligence Agency, prepare a video in which he showed the area of the neighborhood of the Korean Peninsula. And it showed that northwest of North Korea is the second largest economy in the world. And immediately east of North Korea is the fourth largest economy in the world. And then directly south of North Korea is the 10th largest economy in the world. Now here, these people are all in the same climate, the same area. They've interacted over the millennia, and yet one of them is dead last, virtually at the very bottom of all the 200 nations on Earth, and the other one is virtually at the top. And so what he explained was that the reason that is because of a thing called freedom. And that's where people are allowed to take what they have and invest to create a product that people voluntarily want to purchase, and they reach in their pocket and they make an exchange for the product that was produced. If you make the product that they want, then people will buy it. And so after the Second World War, Mr. Honda and the Nissan folks, and Mr. Toyota, they began to make automobiles. And then after the Korean War, why the South Koreans began to, the Hyundai and the Kia. And it so happens that Kim Jong-un is very interested in automobiles. And at that first meeting, he had to borrow a car. And so at the second meeting, he developed a presidential limousine again. But at that one, he was just a young man that he is. And so what Mr. Trump showed him was, he showed the picture of the lights, as was commented on, the fact of lack of activity in that little spot called North Korea. And he said, here's what you need. You need to have people invest. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. And that is that they take their money and they make a product, a factory, a business, where they generate a product that people want. And that puts people to work. And so as you saw it, you can see these businesses and these buildings begin to go up. And he said, look at all the people in Korea, or in Japan and elsewhere. They would love to have these beautiful views. And here was this beautiful coastline of North Korea. And you would see these high rises come up, these beautiful hotels. And then he showed a automobile factory in which the Koreans were working in the automobile factory. And Mr. Trump said to him, see, all of this is available to you. You can do this. All you have to do is to not threaten to destroy people because of with their nuclear weapons. And so I do hope that we're all still in business here. Can you see me?
Yes, we see you.
Okay, good. Well, mine disappeared, but I'll just continue to talk. So as they were doing that, after the meeting, they came out and there was the presidential limousine. the leader of North Korea said, you know, I'd like to see the car. And Mr. Trump said, absolutely, get in. And they climbed around there and they began to make good progress about the idea that if he didn't become a threat to his neighbors, if he eliminated the nuclear weapons, that he could then have this investment from around the world, just as we've seen take place in South Korea, as we've seen take place in Japan after World War II, and in the last decade and a half in China. Now, what is that? And let's just touch on that, and then we'll go to questions. That is this: all wealth is created by three people. That is, there has to be a saver, and then there is an entrepreneur or a business person or an inventor or a creator. We'll call him an entrepreneur. That's a French term for a person who accepts the responsibility for the creation of a business enterprise. And so you have the saver, you have the entrepreneur, and then you have the producer, which is the worker that generates the product. And those all three have to work in harmony. And the first one, of course, is very important. That's the saver. That is, if you want to go into business, there has to be some money in order to build the factory to make the product. And in order to do that, if there's war, then people don't want to invest. They don't want to, if there are very high taxes, if there is corruption, if there is a corrupt government, people don't like to risk their money. So if there's peace, if there is a value system that respects life, respects each other, honors a contract, that's truth. And if they honor truth, that is when they give their word that they'll keep it, then people will take their money and invest in the creation of our product. What product is it? That's where the entrepreneur comes in. That's a very small number of people, and in the neighborhood of about 2%. And they they're very wonderful blessing to the world. You don't want to mistreat them, because if you do, they can get up and move. And quite frankly, we're experiencing that in the United States at this very moment, as the people that were in the fourth largest economy in the Western Hemisphere, the people from Venezuela, that small entrepreneurial group that created this abundant nation, this nation, the wealthiest nation south of the Rio Grande, and a nation with larger oil reserves than any place on the planet, that nation with an unlimited future ahead of it. But when it went to socialism, which is government control, it began to take away from the private individual, so that they then escaped, and they've been coming to the United States. So that government control or socialism can create poverty, whereas the freedom and stability that comes with peace can create wealth. So the three of them is, number one, a saver who is an investor who puts the money up at risk. Number two, the entrepreneur that creates the product. And that has to satisfy the consumer or the customer. The customer decides whether or not that app is any good and whether or not they're going to buy it. The customer decides whether or not he likes the car or doesn't, likes the motorcycle or doesn't, likes the refrigerator, the TV set or doesn't. And that's why little South Korea, the little nation that at the end of the Korean War in the 1950s was third from the bottom, the third poorest nation on earth. But as my wife and I had dinner with the president of the Blue House in Seoul, he explained, he said, when they divided the country, the 38th parallel, he said, we got 75, North Korea got 75% of the arable land. We got 25% of the arable land. We got mountains and we got refugees, but we got freedom. And that freedom then allowed them to produce. That is to save and to have entrepreneurs who would dream up good products. Then they had the workers that produced it, such that the Hyundai and the Kia and these other Samsung refrigerators and all the things that come with it. Now, the question would be, can that apply in North Korea as well? Of course, that's where economics comes in. Economics is a law. It's an economic law. It doesn't ask the height or the weight or the skin color of the person that applies it. And how does it work? Now, let me just in about 3 or 4 minutes explain that. If there's a car going by the front door of your house, there are only two ways that you can get money from the people in the car. Only two. One is called the free enterprise or capitalistic system, where, as I said, you lay awake nights dreaming up ways to do something good for the person, such that they slam on the brakes and pull in and say, oh, you're going to wash my car and sweep the carpeting and clean the windows and clean off the dashboard. I'd much rather have that than have this $10 bill or I'd much rather have this global positioning unit than $200 or that pair of shoes. You create something that they voluntarily reach in their pocket, make an exchange, which at the end of the exchange, they are both wealthier. They have created wealth. They are both better off than they were before, or they won't make the exchange. They only make the exchange if at the end they feel that they are wealthier. Now there's only one other way to get money out of that car going by the house, and that is that you walk out to the car with a gun and you take it and you stick the gun in the window and you say, I want half of everything in your purse. And what's the significance of that? Have you created any wealth? No, no. Have you transferred wealth? Yes, yes. Have you redistributed wealth? Oh, you'll hear politicians always talk about the redistribution of wealth. I remember the mayor of New York constantly talks about how there's plenty of wealth in this country. It's just not distributed properly. And so when the criminal reaches in and takes the money out, he hasn't created any wealth. He's redistributed, but the degree to which he's improved is the degree to which the other person is diminished and no wealth is created. Of course, rather than calling that person calling him a criminal, we could also call him a politician, because the impact is the same, that the government comes and takes things away from people and they do not get the benefit of the reward. And so that's what this is all about, is to how we have to have a value system that respects life, that we honor people. It has to be peace. That way people are willing to put at risk their products and build their machines and all. There has to be an entrepreneur who's rewarded when he dreams and thinks these things up. And then finally, that makes for the producers, the workers, that raise their standard of living. Now, can that happen in North Korea? Absolutely, it can. Can it happen in South Korea? It did. Could it happen in China when after the death of Mao Zedong, they said, we're going to go 50-50 and we'll let people invest in our country and keep half of what they produce. And with that, they abandoned that program, and you saw what happened there. It can happen any place. Now, what we need are leaders. Leaders are people who can see things that other people can't see. They can see around the corner. They can see over the hill. And the purpose of this wonderful organization to have peace and economic development is to see what can be done when people are willing to live in harmony and not threaten the lives of each other. And for that cause, I think that's a noble thing that you have chosen to do. And on behalf of Art and myself and all of us that are engaged here, we're just honored to be a part of it as we discuss how together we can bring not only peace, but prosperity to our friends around the globe that deserve it so much. So, Michael, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That was excellent. We're getting so many comments in about how happy people are to hear this presentation on the role of economic freedom and the power of the law of economics to bring nations like South Korea out of poverty into the 10th most powerful economy in the world. We have a number of questions. I'd like to start with Art and then come back to Bob. We'll go back and forth a little bit. So I'd like to ask EJ, yes, let's have all of our both panelists on the screen. Dr. Lindsey, this came from Alan Saunders. That was an excellent presentation. How do you think the influence of Russia and China and in relationship to the reunification of North and South Korea can be decreased, especially considering the lack of religious freedom and faith in North Korea, China, and Russia? How can Russia and China be addressed?
I would say that's a difficult issue, of course, to be able to give simple answers to that question. I think the best thing you can do is to uphold a positive model of political, economic, and religious freedom as South Korea does, and show the difference in doing that. I know, say within China, they've pursued somewhat of an economic freedom direction, but what, in light of Bob's comments, what I see is more and more restriction of wealth creation, because, say, the Uyghurs, for instance, are cut out of wealth creation, and the Falun Gong and often, believers in Christ are also being either restricted or stopped from wealth creation, and that's going to pay a toll down the road in China's development. And same thing within Russia. I mean, I don't know fully where things are right now, but I know that there was a great desire when the wall came down to really open up economic freedom, but you can't really have that fully without political freedom and without religious freedom. And so the question is, what are the values on which those countries can base their economies? And I think because of those values are somewhat lacking, or maybe totally lacking in some cases, it's going to be difficult to sustain wealth creation in both those places. So South Korea can provide a model of really how to do it. Not perfectly, but they have really done it. I mean, they're a miracle story. There's a story I know I heard a number of years ago shared back in Geneva, the story of South Korea. And now when we go out to speak in different countries to government leaders, we always tell the story of South Korea because they're the quickest one to rise out of desperate poverty into a flourishing society. And so that model is a tremendous model to follow.
Thank you, Art. That's excellent. Also, we realize America's role is obviously critical to help these countries establish the proper order and proper value system. So, Congressman McEwen, Alan asked you, the market activity is widespread now in the DPRK, kind of a, barter economy almost, but it seems that bribery is also rampant. How can the rule of law be established in a unified North Korea? If the two Koreas come together, how is that going to unfold with the rule of law and also the values that we share with America and the Republic of Korea?
Well, that is an absolutely excellent question because it absolutely goes to the core of everything else. That is that if you do not have let's just start with a common system. The economy in the world took off after World War I because the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, established the Bureau of Weights and Measures and established an international standard for the size of bolts and timing and that sort of thing. And so therefore investment, you didn't have to have a different wrench for a car from Japan or France or Germany as you did prior to World War I. That universal made it possible to proceed. In the same manner, it has a universal sense of right or wrong, a standard of right or wrong. Without that, you only have chaos and poverty. And they can call it in Seattle, they can call it a summer of love or whatever the mayor wanted to call it. But where they did away with the rule of law, you have poverty, chaos, destruction, and death. And so the answer to the question is how do we accomplish that? That is the question of the ages. But the fact the question was asked is what's most important. That's what has to be done. And I believe that the American model is the best because it's the first nation and only nation that gave respect for life. And if you respect life, then you respect the liberty and the property and the other things down the line. If you don't respect life, if you'll murder people, have them disappear overnight at their convenience, as you see the death that took place in those radical places in Portland and in Seattle or elsewhere around the world, the Gaza Straits or elsewhere, that's essential. And that's a godly question. That's a respect that God made us. So, and as that has to be a part, just as it was, quite frankly, a part of what happened in South Korea. When South Korea embraced righteousness, it prospered. And together with that example and that friendship, I believe the South Koreans can deliver it to the North as well.
Art, Johan from Europe.
Yeah, let me just make a comment on that too quickly. I just mentioned a couple different books you can read about. I think there are three sort of preconditions for a nation to be able to succeed. One is what Bob just mentioned, the rule of law. And there's a great book about that called The Locust Effect by Gary Haugen.
Very good.
And Victor Boutros. And it's a tremendous book on that essential of the rule of law being established and how it was established in various nations and what can be done to establish it. I think there are clear strategies to be able to do that in various nations. The second thing is corruption is one of the major factors. And I think a really helpful book is a book called Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo. And it's a classic book, particularly on Africa, but it really relates to that area. And then the third book is the third essential is private property. And this book by Hernando de Soto, I think I mentioned earlier, called Mystery of Capital, is really an essential thing. And he argues that that every country has enough resources to be able to sustain its own future, but what's lacking is often property rights being clearly defined to be able to make things happen. And he makes that case very powerfully. Okay.
That goes right to our next question. Johan asks, you mentioned in point 6, the right kind of freedom. What's the wrong kind of freedom? And the second part of the question is in China, the economy increase is now used against the United States. What is your opinion on how to react to that and prevent the same thing happening if North Korea prospers in the future? First, what's the wrong kind of freedom? And second,
he might have asked that question before I defined it later, because I mentioned it in my beginning part.
Yeah.
Right kind of freedom is, there's a difference between the freedom from any restriction, which is the 1789 view of freedom, the freedom of the French Revolution, freedom without faith and without virtue being attached to it. So you can define reality whatever way you want, define morality in the way that you want. That's the 1789 view of freedom. Freedom, equality, fraternity, but it was a different kind of freedom than was the freedom of the founders, which is being free to serve God, free to be able to pursue reality in the way that God has constructed it, you might say. So that that's the different kind of freedom. The 1776 view of freedom is, again, the golden triangle, that faith requires virtue, virtue requires faith, and faith requires freedom. Or freedom requires virtue, virtue requires faith, faith requires freedom. So those are that's the biblical base. Now, I wrote a book on that called Free Indeed, which the first chapter is the biblical view of freedom, and it lays out that freedom from and freedom to be able to do things. And then the second half of the book is political, economic, and religious freedom biblically based values, and to what extent are they? And that I do argue that political, economic, and religious freedom are at least grounded within the scriptures and the biblically based teaching there. So then on to China. I did make some comments. Maybe he asked that question before I made the comments on China, but I do see that that to the degree to which political freedom is quenched, which it by and large is, and religious freedom is stopped, it's going to really hurt the economy. And I think it hurts it, as I mentioned, by restricting wealth creation from religious people, which is going to restrict the creation of wealth all over China. I, for instance, noticed I was talking to someone from China, and I think all the major corporations have to have a Communist Party member on the board, which can veto any decision that the corporation makes. So there's really a severe restriction on being able to make decisions according to economic freedom. I think certainly there's been a growth, but I think you're going to see that growth slow, or maybe even stop, or become very restricted because of the decisions that are being made right now. We have yet to bear the fruit of it. Remember this illustration, Os Guinness uses the idea of a cut flower civilization, that you can have some of the flowers. If you take some flowers, it can look beautiful when you put them in a vase, but they fade fairly quickly. And if you take away the roots, like in America, for that basis for flourishing, you're going to see the civilization fade. And if you cut off some of the roots of what really causes flourishing in China, you're going to also see that economic prosperity fade. That's my view.
That's exactly the UPF view, is that without attending God, without honoring God as the root of our freedom and the creator of our joy and happiness, you're destined to collapse at one point or another. And that was what was always seen about the Soviet Union, and we saw it happen. And you're right, that's correct. If they don't find their roots in God with the help of America, they're doomed to fade.
It's going to be a cut flower civilization. Yes.
Yes. So Congressman McEwen, one more question, then we'd like to go into an open discussion on worldview, the role of worldview. But Congressman McEwen, as a person of, and it's obvious, Bob, why you're the head of CNP, which is some of the most powerful business leaders in America. And I know President Trump came to your forums several times. And really, we thank you for being here. But also, I know you're a man of great faith. And the question comes from Miss Duggan, who says, what should religious leaders do from America or around the world? What should religious leaders do actively to prevent a hot war from occurring with North Korea, China, Japan, United States, and Taiwan? All these are under, there's a big question now, which way it will go. Your advice about religious leaders?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think that religious leaders, like all of us, should do what we were called to do. The scripture says that blessed are the peacemakers. And I think the best way that you do that is by recognizing that we are God's creation. Now, if you believe that man got here on his own and there is no God, then there is no eternity. There is no purpose. And therefore I can readily and easily take your property or take your reputation or take your life. And that's why our nation was founded on the very fundamental principle that everything that we have comes not from an army, not from a bloodline, not from a property, but only it comes from God. And that idea had been percolating for a couple of hundred years before anybody did it. But when America started to do it, then people like Lafayette and others came to America because they wanted to see it take place. And this little 4% of the population of the world created more books, plays, symphony, copyrights, inventions, airplanes all over the world. Why? Because an American invented the airplane and the light bulb and the telegraph and the telephone. There are skyscrapers all over the world because an American, Elisha Otis, invented the elevator in places where it's 100 degrees because an American named Willis Carrier invented the air conditioner. And so when a person recognized that God made them with this special talent, then they can create. And I'm here to tell you that I refuse to believe that out of 1 billion people for 50 years, there was never one Thomas Edison in all of China. I believe that there were perhaps hundreds or thousands of them. Mm-hmm. But when there was not freedom and there was not respect for human life, when people were used as though they were animals and not as an almighty creation of Almighty God, then that capacity to create and build was destroyed. So how do we do to get people to live comfortably together? Our religious leaders need to speak out as to who gave us life and that life is worth preserving. And from that comes all of the benefits that come with freedom that God built into each one of us. No two people, there are no two hearts that have the same signature, no two hearts beat alike, no two irises, no two earlobes. The list goes on, no every single cell, fingerprint. God made us and gave us talents that no one else has, and that requires peace that comes from God, and therefore gives us freedom.
Congressman McEwen illustrated very well, says Dale Garrett, the difference between capitalism and socialism. Trade creates wealth. What about economic sanctions on North Korea, especially oil, the basis of fertilizer and farm equipment, which is also, some experts say, is causing the counterproductive reduction of food production and more dependence on China. You have any thoughts on that? And then we'll go
to that is certainly that's a legitimate question, and it should be handled very gingerly. Sanctions are a weapon, and weapons are only to be used under a threat. And the reason that we don't go around hitting our children, but we recognize if they don't behave, there has to be a time in which there's discipline. And when a nation is such as North Korea prides itself on threatening a power that is essential and responsible for us to respond. Without the United States standing there with a stick, we can be very skeptical as to what would happen in South Korea, what would happen in the Chinese peninsula, the Japanese waters, and elsewhere if there were not some sort of demand that they behave according to international standards. That's Americans, by the way, Michael. Americans don't like that. Never in the history of mankind has a nation become the premier nation on earth with what it didn't seek it and knew what it had to do to stay there, except the United States of America after World War II had it thrust upon it. And so the United States has to do these kinds of things, even though it wishes that it didn't. It has to do it gingerly, but nevertheless, it's required.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'd like to invite Chairman Tom McDivot to come back on the panel here. I'd like to have 4 of us together here. We'd like to conclude this wonderful program with a little discussion on worldview. So EJ, if you could bring, or Roger, you could bring Mr. Tom McDivot back. We'd like to have a little discussion on the role of worldview in terms of helping us bring the world into kind of a common ground of understanding. And worldview right now is of essential positioning in terms of faith worldview that has faith at the center. Right now, there is a worldview struggle going on in America, trying to say that America is simply a socialist, materialist economy that wanted to institute slavery simply for economic prosperity. There's another worldview that said God inspired America, and that, as Bob said, it didn't prosper because they took it. It prospered because they continued to honor God. There were mistakes made on the way, but it's actually, we are correcting those mistakes by penance and going through the traditions of faith. So let's have an open discussion about worldview. Art, can you help us understand, shape a faith worldview that could also touch the hearts of the Chinese people, touch the hearts of all people? We believe that everyone, without exception, can be touched.
Yeah, of course, that's a massive issue. It's one that I've worked on pretty much all my life, is that kind of thing. But let me just mention one thing that's really important in terms of worldview, and that's the importance of human dignity and worldview. I think the biblical idea that people are made in the image of God is, I believe, the only secure and easily justifiable basis for human dignity. The way that C.S. Lewis put it is that you have never met a mere mortal. There are no ordinary people. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, what are they? They are to our life as the life of a gnat. And this idea of the image of God and that there are no ordinary people, you've never met a mere mortal, sets apart each individual as a person of dignity and worth and value. And the other systems that are out there, say the Marxist systems or what the collectivist systems, don't really see the value of the individual and individual dignity. And that really underlies what Bob was talking about wealth creation, that you have people that have great dignity. I think that you might argue that Genesis 1:26-28 shows the purpose of people in the creation. I think that people were made in the image of God to use their creativity to unfold the potential of the world around them. Let me say that one more time. That I think our ultimate purpose is people are made in the image of God to be able to use their creativity to unfold the potential of the creation around them. And that's wealth creation that Bob McEwen has talked about. And I think that biblical foundation, both in terms of the image of God, which is there in Genesis 1:26-28, and then also the purpose to exercise dominion, is very foundational for us being able to move forward.
Thank you, Art. This is very important. So Bob, your thoughts on worldview. Our biblical worldview would say we reap what we sow. That's Jesus' teaching. That's the teaching of the Lord. We reap what we sow. And if we sow good seed, we're going to reap a harvest of good fruit. If we offer 10% of our harvest, then we're ensured the fortune and the protection of heaven. There may be bumps in the road, but the prosperity of a nation as well as a family really is based more on those kinds of principles we see over generations. This is true. And how do you relate with bringing that worldview to the parts of the world that say there is no God and it's all material?
Well, I think that is the issue. It boils down, in my opinion, to one question, that either you believe that if there is a God, man created it. So if you believe that man created God,
yeah,
or you believe that God created man. And from that fork in the road, everything else flows. You can go to the philosophy section of any bookstore or any library. You can tell by page 5. You believe that man got here on his own and that he's the standard? Or do you believe that there is a God and God has a standard? And our founders were not ambivalent on the topic. They made it abundantly clear we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men were created and endowed by that creator. And from that comes the peace and prosperity that we enjoy. But a person much more intellectual and wise on these sorts of things is Tom McDivot. I'd much rather hear from him.
Tom,
I want to hear from Tom. Yes.
welcome back.
You set me up too much. Hey, on behalf of everybody, what an amazing afternoon. I just feel so edified and can't wait to hear the next lecture from the two professors here. Michael, I think we should, on behalf of our whole audience, Dr. Lindsey and Congressman McEwen, we need your leadership at the core of IAD on a global level as well as America. I'm imagining, for example, on this worldview discussion, imagine if, even using the Washington Times and IAD, if certain things that come up in popular culture could be contrasted and examined from that imago Dei, made in the image of God, versus the Darwinian concept. In other words, the value of an individual. And I think you both articulated it so well. I do think we're in a battle for culture. And I like the way that Chuck Colson used to speak about it, that culture is upstream from politics. And I'd love to hear both of you touch on that, because economics is a major pillar of culture, as well as media and everything else. And so, Michael, if I could, I'd invite both Bob and Art. Could you give us any advice? You got a couple hundred activists on the call here, a couple thousand on Facebook. We want to work together to make a difference. You're both highly networked. I remember Art telling me that you have a network of some 300 biblical economists around the country. And by the way, I put on the special sections, I linked them to the chat room. Wait till you see the stuff that Dr. Lindsey put together with Cheryl Wetstein at the Washington Times. I mean, he is an expert. He's one of the top world experts on C.S. Lewis, applied Christianity. And we were just so proud. So love to keep doing that. But how do both of you see the way to restore culture centered on God? And what role does the family have in all that? And I'll just shut up. I just want to listen a little bit more.
Bob, you want to do that first?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, I mean, of course, it's such a big question. I'll just talk about three things that Institute for Faith Work and Economics has had as their main emphasis. And that is, as I've said often, freedom, fulfillment, and flourishing. Freedom as opposed to bondage and slavery. You've got to take your pick between those two. Some worldviews have a kind of bondage or slavery, and other views really exalt the biblical kind of freedom that's there. And fulfillment as opposed to frustration, and flourishing as opposed to poverty. And when you have political, economic, and religious freedom, I think people are going to be free to be able to use their creativity to unfold the potential of the creation around them. And if they do that, they're going to be able to be fulfilled. And if millions of people are doing that and fulfilled, there's going to be flourishing in a society. And those are the three values that we often hold up at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, and try to develop and unpack really what that means in all those different arenas. So again, that's another three things. Of course, that what you've asked is a massive question and would require a lot of development in order to lay it out. Bob, you want to add to that? Or?
No, sir.
Okay.
So Bob, one thing you did say that was very, very important is that when you take away the faith and these values, then there's no limit to the attitude and the actions of a faithless generation, a faithless nation, to take your property, take your reputation, and even take your life. And there's no conscience, there's no concern about that, because they don't see it that you're reaping what you sow. They don't think there's any consequence because they don't think there's an afterlife or anything else. So I think that we've really come back to you, Bob. How about that worldview? We have this fork in the road, right? It really is so serious. We can cooperate, we can work together, but eventually, again, that fork in the road is going to lead to, a conflict, because one side of the fork in the road believes that there's no consequence for them being lawless and taking your property. It all centers on their values, that they're supreme. Go ahead.
That's right. Every barroom brawl, every schoolyard scuffle boils down to two words: who says? the answer is either I say or God says. And so every question, how do you feel about abortion? Well, I think, or God says. And that's what Adam and Eve at the beginning, all the way through, all of us, every one of us during our lifetime have to come to that decision. Either I'm going to be God, I'll decide what's right or wrong, or I'm going to follow what he says. And poor Moses was out there struggling with all those folks in the desert, getting himself worn out. His father-in-law came to him after he said, God told me that you're supposed to do something. You're supposed to divide these people up to federal, state, and local government, put people in charge of thousands, hundreds, and tens, and said, and here's the people that you put in charge. It's only three things. I can't give you a 4-year course in government. Here's the three things that you look for, Moses. Number one, fear God. That fear is the old English term for respect or honor. So you want people that fear God, respect God. Why? Because if there is no God, then that means that I'm God. And as a little rule of thumb, you don't want to marry a person who thinks they're God. And you don't want to go into business with a person who thinks they're God. And the scripture says you don't want to elect a person to office who thinks they're God. It said, fear God, lovers of truth. Now, what is truth? Truth is either what God says, and everything else is opinion, or what I say is truth. And so I can sit there with Oprah and we can say your truth and his truth and his truth. But that means you try building a house, if everybody's ruler, one is 13 inches, one's 15, one's 18, and you can't build it. There has to be a ruler that is 12 inches and everybody agrees that that's the truth. And so, and then thirdly, he said those haters of socialism. Now he used the term covetousness. And in free enterprise, the way I get money is I do something good for you, we make an exchange. Under socialism, I come and I take what you have. And covetousness, I want what you have. And so Moses was told, those that fear God, that lovers of truth, haters of covetousness. And that's a worldview, and that's the choice. Those that follow that prosper, those that don't fail. It only works that way every time.
Well, Congressman and Art, this brings us, and Tom, this brings us to we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So Tom, a question for you on that statement. Did Thomas Jefferson come up with those words, or were those God's words?
Well, I think both Bob and Art have a great deal of scholarship in that area, but I think that the question is really, what was the motivating force behind the creation of America? And if you look at the human history from the perspective that, as Bob outlined and Art outlined, that God exists, and that history is a function, a process to reach an ideal that God had in mind that was broken at the fall, well, then what role does America have? What is America's providential role? Was God behind it? And we see that. We have the eyes to see it. So yes, Jefferson's penning of the Declaration of Independence, his theories, all of that percolated over centuries was, in my view, God-inspired without a doubt. That's why we can say that America is God's hope. And yet we've got to move it forward and come together, especially the body of Christ. That's how I would see it.
That is a big discussion now. Was that just something that man came up with and then he didn't live it, therefore it's not true? Or did God come up with it? And I think that's where we all would agree. God came up with that. And that what the beautiful thing is, if we live it, prosperity comes and blessing. If we don't live it, then there's lacking, but that doesn't diminish the truth. Truth doesn't change. The truth never changes. So this is a beautiful time that we've had with you, and I'm very interested to do another seminar on worldview. I'd like to do another one with our whole panel coming back, and I would like to share really quick my screen for just a moment, because Tom brought up the work that he did together with also Art on the Washington Times Faith at Work. There were two special sections here in the Washington Times that were just outstanding. And it was just a wonderful work that's also, there's Os Guinness and, and there's Dr. Lindsley right there. And then we have one more here that's just a beautiful, beautiful program of the faith at work, right? Was that faith at work, Tom?
Faith and work and faith and flourishing. Yeah.
There's a faith at work. Another one. Why the biblical theology of work leads to a flourishing society. This is so important. That's a beautiful vision, Art, that actually, and Bob, that North Korea could end up prospering.
Absolutely.
If we partner properly with America and South Korea, its own family, and eventually that border will not be needed anymore. And we hope that China can go that way too. We don't close the door.
You know,
that can't happen. It
Dr.
can't.
Jenkins, that's one, if I could jump in, that's one of the reasons why the recent talks that Jim Rogers has given, in our programs, he's spoken with us for about a dozen different times. And just the other day, gave a fabulous talk. We need to send that link out to everyone, Roger, of an economic vision of prosperity if the Korean Peninsula were united. Just take the 38th parallel down, like Ronald Reagan said to Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. That vision of bringing 38th parallel down and allowing for families to reunite, allowing for prosperity to occur. Jim Rogers is a genius financially, and boy, he sees it. He really sees it, and that was quite fascinating. He serves as an advisor to our IED network, which I hope both of you will step in and help us out as well. So,
Well, we thank
without a vision, the people perish, out of Proverbs, right?
Thank you,
That's-
Chairman Tom McDivot of the Washington Times. We're now at the close. What we have is every Tuesday at 2 p.m. we're doing a program on worldview on dealing with North and South Korea reunification. Last week we had Ambassador Christopher Hill and also Dr. Manzarov from Georgetown, as well as Joseph Tutrani, who's ambassador to the six-party talks. Every week at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, we're having experts come and share about either politics or economy or religion or even culture and arts and how that can help bring peace with Northeast Asia. We honor you, Congressman McEwen, our dear friend, and also Reverend Dr. Art Lindsley. We can't thank you enough. Final words, Bob and Art and Tom.
Well, I would just quickly say that what you said about North and South Korea, I remember when Mao Zedong died, the conditions in China were just abominable. There were no automobiles. Everybody had their hair cut the same way, wore the same clothes. The poverty was just hard to imagine. Deng Xiaoping went down to Singapore, met with Lee Kuan Yew. He said, he was startled at the wealth. And he said, you mean China, you mean Asian people can do this? And Lee Kuan Yew said, Asia's got nothing to do with it. It's the freedom. And they went back and made the changes and said that a communist country would still have to have 51% ownership. And so they only went half as fast. But look what happens when you have 50% freedom versus 0% freedom. And that's the opportunity for North Korea as well.
All right.
Just a comment here that I think that when I was in South Korea, I remember people observing that nobody thought that the wall would come down ever between the East and West in Berlin. But the wall did come down. It would seem like a miracle that it happened so quickly. And I'm hoping that that will be the parallel with North and South Korea, that we don't see how it can be possible right now, but who knows? It never was seemed possible with East and West.
With God, all things are possible. Thank you, Art. And Tom, final words?
Let me pick up on what both Bob and Art said. And, Bob and Liz, you were with us on a fact-finding trip. We went up to the DMZ. Remember that a couple of years ago? And Art, we've done a lot of things together. You were over in the Pyeongchang Peace Forum a couple of times. And I just want to thank the co-founder of UPF, Dr. Moon, Hak Jahan Moon, who we like to call her the Mother of Peace. But she put a stake in the ground recently with a profound commitment of prayer and activity that in a certain frame of time, like in the next several years, namely the next 2 years, something could shift if people of all faiths, especially headed up with a Judeo-Christian ethos, come together with prayer and with commitment and work. Things could change, and we're beginning to see that happen. And just want to thank everybody that's on the show today and everybody that is watching. Let's continue to work together and prosper together and pray for each other and pray for God's will to be done on earth, as Jesus told us in the Lord's Prayer. So thank you so much, guys.
Thank you,
Appreciate your
Tom,
time.
and thank you.
I'd like to thank Alan Jessen, who's the North American coordinator for the International Association for Peace and Economic Development. I'd like to bring back for our closing Mr. Roger Weatherall, who is the chairman and the coordinator for IAED for USA. Roger, give us our marching orders for the future.
Well, I just wanted to thank everybody. This has been really an informative discussion, and I really want to thank especially Congressman McEwen and Dr. Lindsley. I really hope that we can work together on developing programs and putting together the ideas that can lead to the creation of a better world. I wanted to invite everybody to our next program that's going to be on May 20th. This is going to be a discussion of social value investing with Dr. William Imeke and how we can use money to create a better society. And we're looking especially at the telehealth, which is really big in the news at this moment. You probably are aware that there have been several bills passed recently in the United States about telehealth programs, but we are going to be talking with Dr. Ganapathy from India, who was a pioneer in this field and has established one of the largest telehealth networks in the world with something like 2 million calls every year coming into that organization in India. And he did that 20 years ago. So please sign up. I put the registration link into the chat if you want to participate in that one. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you,
And,
Roger. Next Tuesday on May 18th, we will have the International Association for Peace and Development, which is religious leaders talking about how to overcome the challenges in Northeast Asia. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roger.
thank you. Bye,
Thanks
everyone.
very much. Great job.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.